Have you ever been using your computer and just something goes wrong and you think, damn, this is probably the worst operating system that has ever been made? Well, you might be wrong, because in this video we've compiled the list of the 5 operating systems that might be the very worst things to ever be installed on somebody's computer. And for this list, we are going to be going in order from bad to worst. Now, this is obviously subjective. If there's something that has been left out of this list, I would love to hear about it down below. But for now, this is what we got for you. Starting off with Lindows, now known as Linspire. Lindows was first started in 2001 with the goal to make a Linux distribution designed to compete with Windows, offering a very similar UI and allowing you to run Windows applications. This being done through Wine and their tool called Click to Run. Now, to its credit, this may not have been the very first software manager in Linux, but it was one of the first that gave you a graphical interface to allow you to browse for various packages and discover new applications. And that sounds great, right? Well, Click to Run was not a free service. It costs around $20 a month for the basic version and $50 for the premium version. On top of that, it heavily advertised running Windows apps, but their solution to running apps was just Wine. And we all know how well Wine actually works, let alone in 2002. So there was just little point in paying for Lindows when you could just use basically any free Linux distribution. To be fair though, at this time, commercial Linux distributions were a lot more common even on the desktop. At this time, you could go to the store and get like a boxed copy of Red Hat Linux 9.0. However, even then, there were better options. Now, you may be wondering, where is Lindows today? Well, Microsoft is tempted to sue them for the name, but would later buy it for $20 million, causing a rename to Linspire. And personally, for a business venture to basically rip off a Microsoft name and get them to pay you for it is definitely a W in my opinion. Later, the community would make a free version called FreeSpire, but that would later be discontinued after the release of Linspire 6.0 and FreeSpire 2.0 in 2001, until they came back in 2019. But all of these distros are just Ubuntu respins that aren't really actually that good either. They no longer have any unique features, and they seem to change the desktop environments with every single release, with FreeSpire 8 shipping XFCE, 8.2 shipping Plasma, and 9 shipping GNOME. So at least when it comes to the world of Linux, this is easily argued to be one of the worst. Granted, I have covered some other distributions that definitely put up a competing fight. Next, we go back to the year of my birth, 1996. JavaSoft under Sun Microsystems, the company behind Java, was trying to showcase a bunch of use cases for the Java language in JVM. So they decided to develop an OS that booted straight into JVM that could run on anything from TVs, routers, pagers, basically any embedded computer. And because it was running on JVM, it could run on the architecture that JVM supported, including ARM, PowerPC, and x86. It was somewhat impressive with 256 kilobytes of RAM and 512 kilobytes of ROM. You would get a microkernel, a graphics and windowing system, and more. And it also came with a web browser called Hot Java Browser. Now that all sounds great. Of course, it's on this list, so it has a problem. Java applications would run over your network, and this was the 90s. On top of all that, we just know how slow Java is in general. So this resulted in one of the slowest and most painful operating systems to use of all time. Because of this, adoption was very bad with only a few hardware releases such as Sun Java Station, so JavaOS would eventually be canned in 2001 with Java Me being the new replacement. Also, something funny, one of the 7 team members was a co-architect on Copland, another OS that we will touch on a little bit later. Now, this operating system is really obscure. I did have trouble finding information on this, so big thank you to Cameron for his video where he covers it on an actual Sun JavaScript computer that he happened to get his hands on. Now for the operating system that you were probably thinking of when you clicked on this video, and one that is actually near and dear to my heart, and that is Windows Me, or Windows Millennium Edition. Growing up, I did start on Windows 95. That's the computer we had in our house, but definitely in my early years, I spent the most time on a Windows Me machine. Primarily because it was my grandma's machine, and she would have a bunch of those like discs that you could get at 7-Eleven, and they had like 50 flash games on it. I spent quite a bit of time on that. This came out in the year 2000, was the final Windows edition based on DOS. And this sort of acted as a, oh, my thing died. That's the problem with traveling. This was a transitional operating system between the X9 series based on DOS and the NT series, which powered Windows 2000 and would go on to power Windows XP. While this was a quite innovative version of Windows that would add many of the staples we know today, such as System Restore, automatic updates, and universal plug and play, Windows Me would be known more for its crazy instability issues and constant blue screens. The reason it was so unstable is due to its transitional nature and development hell before it. Windows 98 was supposed to be the last version of Windows to use the DOS-based 9X kernel, and this sparked Windows Neptune, which was codenamed for Windows 2000-based successor to Windows 98. However, Windows Neptune would be merged into Windows Odyssey to form Windows Whistler, which would later become Windows XP. So they would start working on Windows Millennium instead and rushed it out in less than a year of development, which resulted in a super rushed, buggy, unstable product, which would be almost universally dunked on. Now before we move on, I do need to thank our sponsor, something that will work far better than Windows Me, and that is Akamai Connected Cloud. It's super easy to spin up your very own Linode on Akamai Connected Cloud, as when you go into the dashboard, you can pick a wide variety of Linux distributions for a base install to get started from scratch, or you could dive into their marketplace, which I do quite frequently, to spin up a wide variety of web services, whether that be actual front-facing websites, back-end analytics, databases, or even game servers. The monthly rates are charged hourly, so if you want to spin up a high-power server and test some things out, you could do so relatively cheap. And speaking of cheap, you could get a $100 60-day credit if you use the link down below. So from there, the next operating system is the famous Red Star OS, the official operating system of the People's Republic of North Korea. Before Red Star, this country generally ran Red Hat Linux or Windows XP, but then came along Red Star OS. And it is hard to get information on Red Star OS just due to the nature of it and how secretly the North Korean regime is, but we know versions 1 and 2 resembled Windows XP, while 3 and 4 had a more macOS inspired feel. Newer versions seem to be based on Fedora with a heavily modified desktop environment based on KDE Plasma. Booting into Red Star OS 3.0, we have a very macOS-like installer for the operating system, and then you actually get into a moderately good-looking system once installed. So it seems all is well. But what makes this one of the worst operating systems of all time? Well, that's because it's used by the North Korean government to restrict their people. It ships with its own web browser forked from Firefox called Nayara, I think, which is not only proven to be vulnerable, but also, of course, restricts users in North Korea from accessing many of the websites in the open web. It also has backdoors and watermarked files to help the government link things back to individual users. It allows the North Korean government to get into the operating system and delete files that they don't like, and there are other vulnerabilities such as allowing remote code execution, and the OS prevents the user from actually tampering with the operating system. There is a way to actually remove all the malware on Red Star OS, and Mental Outlaw actually has a really good video on how to do that. If you want to learn more about this operating system, I do recommend checking out the videos from both Mental Outlaw and Some Ordinary Gamers. Both have great videos on this subject. And now finally, we have Copland. This is one that I would personally consider to maybe be the worst operating system of all time. Now, Apple had a problem in the 90s. macOS Classic was overall a flawed design, and to explain why, let's talk about how multitasking works. Modern operating systems, including Windows, modern Mac, and Linux, use multitasking systems called preemptive multitasking, where a scheduler allocates your CPU time for different tasks on the OS depending on how important they are, and automatically manages everything going on. Classic versions of macOS were using something called cooperative multitasking, where processes would voluntarily give up CPU time for other processes on the computer to run, which means one poorly designed application could take down your entire system and cause major instability. This made the later versions of macOS Classic incredibly unstable, especially System 7 and onward. So Apple needed a replacement quick because Windows 9X was already technologically superior, and other options like Windows NT, BOS, and even Linux and Warp were already outpacing Apple. They tried collaborating under IBM with the IntelliGent project to make a more modern foundation for macOS, but those efforts collapsed. So they would start working on Copland, the very new replacement for macOS. This would be built in a new kernel-based OS with preemptive multitasking and would use a container called Blue Box to support legacy code. Now, Copland was supposed to come out in 1996, and they would go and do a developer demo earlier in the year, but it barely worked. They would then promise more features to account for delays, causing more delays, further causing a loop where they were causing more delays, promising more features. The cycle continued. Now, later in the year in 1996, they actually released a developer preview, but it was so buggy, the operating system would crash just sitting on idle, with absolutely nothing happening. So Apple would eventually completely scrap the project and buy out Next for Next Step, which would form into Mac OS X and eventually Mac OS that we know today. And if you do want to learn more why I think Copland is probably one of the worst operating systems in the world, I do recommend you check out the Science Elf's video, The Development Disaster Behind Mac OS, and Paul's Crap has a bunch of video where he actually checks out old development CDs for Copland, some really good stuff. So with all that, those are some of the worst operating systems that have ever been made. Again, like I mentioned before, what do you think are the worst operating systems that you have used? Did I miss some in this video? I probably did. Please let me know what those are down below, and with all that, I do hope you have an absolutely beautiful day, and goodbye.